It's so lovely to see so many familiar faces. It's great. So thank you all for being here. And I was so excited when I saw that David's book was one of the books we'd be discussing at the fifth Wagstaffe event. So that's something to be very proud of. And so I asked if I could please be the moderator for this session, because I'm a little bit of a Apollo 11 fan. I do actually believe it happened. I don't believe in any of those theories. And, I'm sure quite a few of you, respectfully, will remember the landing on the moon and remember where you were and remember the emotion behind it. I was a little girl, very little, Kay. And, but I remember a TV screen, but I remember my mother giving me a Sunny Boy, which was probably a little bit more exciting. But I've been intrigued by, the courage of those men to go to space, and then they may never come back. And some actually didn't, as you know. So I kind of put my hand up and said, can I please be this person? Because it fascinates me, because it's such a human story. It is an incredibly important landmark in world history, and so much around that whole political life that was going on with the Cold War, etc., etc. So David is an extraordinary human being, and I just thought I'd be cheat and just read straight from the book. David grew up in coastal New South Wales. After leaving school, he trained as a deck officer at the Australian Maritime College and spent several years travelling the world in merchant ships. He then completed combined arts law degree at the University of Sydney and worked as a litigation lawyer. This guy's really smart. First and then in London. Upon his return to Australia, he began teaching and writing. In 2016, he published The Midnight Watch, a huge seller. We'll talk a little bit about that book. It's a novel about the ship that saw the Titanic's distress rockets but didn't go to her rescue. Extraordinary book. His research for this novel took him to London, Liverpool, Boston, New York, and finally to the site of the sinking of the Titanic. David currently lives in Sydney, where he teaches, writes, and makes cocktails. Welcome, please, David Dyer.
Thank you. Thanks, Benny. Thanks so much.
I thought that said enough, actually. So, David, I just want to talk a little bit about Midnight Watch, because it's it really did introduce you to the world. As a kid, you were totally obsessed with the Titanic, so we're not allowed to let you go on for too long. But where did that obsession come from, and how did that become the Midnight Watch?
Well, I was a child prone to obsessions, but I remember being about 4 years old, I went to my grandmother's house, and on the old television there was the movie A Night to Remember, which we watched. And there was something that just clicked with my childhood imagination, especially the scenes from the behind when the ship is rearing up into the air and then plunging down. That really stuck with my childhood imagination, so much so that I think I became almost unwell, a Titanic psychopath ever since. And I made models of the ship out of anything that I could grab, Legos, plasticine, paper. I wrote stories about the Titanic. I told anybody who would listen. I gathered facts. This is before the internet, so that meant reading. I memorised the World Book Encyclopedia entry for the thing. And then through high school, I wrote more and more stories about it until I was banned from ever writing another Titanic story. I remember one was English. In English in year 10, you had to do some creative writing part of the moderator, it was called back then. And no matter what the topic was, I would adapt it to the Titanic, and it led to some pretty impressive results, I thought. Well, I remember the topic was crowds. So I wrote, of course, crowds of people in the water after the Titanic it sank. And
a little bit sick, but
a little bit sad, but it's got a bit of natural dramatic energy to it, and so that did quite well, that one. But on and on it went until not only schools banned me, but my friends. And
I think that was very wise, and we'll probably start now talking about that.
Thank you for that indulgence.
But then it became the Midnight Watch, and I didn't know that story, and if you could share that story briefly with our audience, please, that would be good.
Well, I was obsessed with the Titanic, and I've been joking about it, but it became quite serious, and I ended up actually working in London as a solicitor for Hill Taylor Dickinson, which is the firm that represented the Titanic's owners back in 1912. So I sort of, it was almost by accident, or was it, that I ended up there. And while I was in London, I really started to try to. So I was a lawyer, not a writer, but I wanted to solve a problem which had been in my mind since I was a kid, which is, what did this ship do that was near the Titanic that saw its distress rockets and didn't go to the rescue? And I read a book when I was a kid that said that ship thought those distress rockets were celebrations of this maiden voyage. But after I'd been to sea myself, and when I forgot that bit, I ended up going to sea as a ship's officer before I became a lawyer. That made no sense to me. No ship has a party at 1 o'clock in the morning on a Monday morning. No ship fires rockets in celebration. That could not have been the solution. So what was the solution? Why did this ship that was stopped? It had nothing to do, it had stopped because of the ice that was around. It had nothing to do but watch this distant ship do all sorts of strange things, including fire rockets, including sort of lift its rear end up. All of these things were discussed on the bridge of this watching ship, but they didn't wake the radio guy up, and they didn't get the captain up onto the bridge, and the ship never went. And the next morning, when they discovered on this ship that the Titanic had sunk, they raced down there, got there just as the Carpathia, the rescue ship, was bringing up the last lifeboat, and learnt that 1,500 people had died. And from that moment on, that captain and the people on the bridge had that like an albatross around their neck for the rest of their lives, and they reacted in different ways to that heavy burden, and that really obsessed me, so much so that I went to Liverpool. I spent a week in the Liverpool archives because that's where the captain of this ship's papers were. I read his letters. It's a real tragedy, really. I went to Boston, where this ship eventually berthed, and read all the newspapers there. I went to London, and eventually I went to the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. On the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, I was over the wreck. And strangely, it was similar weather conditions. It was a dead middle of the Atlantic, cold, dead flat ocean, and I could sort of actually see a ship off in the distance. So that would have been what it was like for the Titanic's people. They were all looking at this ship that was close as they were sinking, desperately trying to get it with their rockets. So I got a real sense of what it was like, and I spoke to Fran Kelly on ABC Radio Live from this wreck site. It was really quite an extraordinary event, and I thought, I've got to solve this problem, and I eventually did.
And you wrote The Midnight Watch,
and The Midnight Watch is my answer. If you want to know what happened and why they didn't go, it's a tragic, sad story, but a psychologically interesting one. The Midnight Watch.
And that's a great introduction to the Kingdom of Dust, this Kingdom of Dust, because it is quite interesting, the psychology of all the players that we have in this book. So we have 3 main characters, but I think what we'd like to hear from you is, did you ever want to be an astronaut?
Well, not as much as I wanted to be a ship's captain, but I was interested in objects that move, so trains, planes, spaceships and ships. And I read a book when I was a little kid called You Will Go to the Moon, and that was written in the early 1960s before we'd landed on the moon, and I believed it. I was reading in the early 70s, by the way. Because I'm quite young.
Tell us a little bit about this book, because it really is quite wonderful. I so enjoyed it.
This Kingdom of Dust. So I was interested in space, and after The Midnight Watch had come out, I was working on a different project about a plane crash, actually. And I happened to be in Sydney, and a friend of mine visited with her son from Tasmania. And we were having dinner at the Lord Roberts in Darlinghurst. And the son he's 16 years old, and he was up doing a NIDA course, so he's a dramatic type. And he was texting a lot. And I noticed him, you know teenagers with their phones, right? They text. And he saw me noticing him, and he apologised to me, and he said, "I'm so sorry. it's my dad. He's so needy because this is the first time he's been left alone. Because his mother, so he's alone in Launceston, which apparently is a scary thing. So so he said he's very needy. He's texting me all the time, and I sort of rose to my impressive authorial height and said, "Well, you need to cut him off. It's a bit of tough love. You need to just cut him loose for his own benefit." And as I was saying that, from somewhere in my mind came an analogy, just like NASA was going to do if Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had become trapped on the moon. They were going to, because there's no hope of rescue, nothing that could be done, but they'd lived there for quite a while, radioing to Earth. NASA was going to cut their radio communications off. It was the kindest thing to do. So that's what you need to do with your father. And, you know, of course, I was only joking. I was only joking. He was laughing, and although he did stop texting his dad. But later in the dinner, after another glass of wine, I forget who it was. It was either him or his mother, my friend, or me, who said, that would make a great novel. What would NASA have done? And from that moment on, I started to research. I knew that they would cut off communications, but I started to do a deep dive into what would NASA have done? What would the wives have done? What would the world have done? What would have happened? And it was the thing that NASA most worried about. It was the Apollo 11 mission. The first landing on the moon was a very risky mission. The Saturn V rocket that took off from Florida could have exploded on the pad. There could have been all sorts of trouble on the way. They were very worried that the little spacecraft that landed on the moon would crash as it tried to land. That was a real worry. They worried that something might go wrong during the spacewalk, a torn spacesuit, or that they might get swallowed up by the dust. But the thing they most worried about was that they would go back into the spaceship and it had one engine and one engine only. There was no plan B, no redundancy. They pressed the button and it took off. And if it didn't take off, they were dead. And I thought, if I were Buzz or Neil walking around on the moon, that's all I would have been able to think of. Is that button going to work? Can we?
And actually, that button features quite heavily in the book, and it's so fascinating because throughout the entire book, you know something. Well, just because we know that this is the premise of the book, but so we're learning about how three people deal with this whole scenario of Joan Aldrin, the wife of Buzz, waiting to hear what's happening. Buzz, what his view is, while he's walking around the moon, what's happened to Buzz, who is Buzz. And then the third character, which I think is really interesting, is Aquarius, who's a journalist, but he actually is Norman Mailer. And I didn't know this. I didn't know that Norman Mailer was part of this kind of big... So the premise is how these three people are reacting to this incredibly important part of history. And you've done this incredibly well. But first of all, I'd like you to tell us all about Joan and the whole Astro Wives. The Astro Wives were a very cliquey group of women because their husbands go up and they may not go down. And Joan Aldrin quoted, and it's something along the lines of, I married an engineer, but I ended up with the world hero. So that changed her life incredibly. But tell us a little about Joan and what life was like for an Astro wife.
Well, Joan Aldrin, the wife of Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, which turns out to be quite an important point that he was second. She's an extraordinary figure. And it was, when I was trying to figure out this, the idea for this book sat in my brain for about a year because I couldn't really think of how to make it work, because I thought there'll be two men in a spaceship slowly starving of oxygen. That's what I call a unidirectional dramatic vector.
I.e. boring.
It goes down, and at the bottom they either survive or they don't, and either answer was going to be very unsatisfactory for the reader. So I thought, I can't figure out really how to write this. The setting is so confined. Maybe Samuel Beckett could do it, but not me. But then I discovered when I was upstairs in Berkelow's in Sydney that Norman Mailer had written in his book about the moon landing a scene where Joan Aldrin gave a press conference just after Buzz and Neil had landed on the moon. And in that little scene, she sort of leapt out of the page at me. And I suddenly realised she's my way into this story. Joan and Janet, the wife of Neil, and other women on the ground who do the most extraordinary things. In real life, they do extraordinary things. I mean, their husbands are doing very risky things. The tension. I mean, they have a squawk box, which is a microphone or a radio device in their living room, relaying in real time what's going on in the mission. So if that mission suddenly fails, which it could, they would know immediately. I mean, it's a stressful time for them to be sitting there, and they feel strangely powerless. And there was a sort of sisterhood of these astro wives, and they really clung together, because sometimes the husbands were killed. There were quite a few astro widows. So Joan struck me, the more I read about her, as a particularly courageous and complex person, and a woman who would take no. Take no shit. Right? Yeah. She was a strong.
She was tough.
A tough person, and she ends up being. Well, I can't give too much away, but she ends up being, I think, the toughest person in the book.
Because she kind of had to be in a way too, because they've got all these NASA people around them all the time. There's journalists, there's the Reverend. Plus she's got to have a life. She's still got 3 kids who also know that their dad is up there and may or may not come back. But they're still worried about their pet snakes and the pool and all and life goes on. But then the wives have to contend with the whole world watching them, and there were people parked out the whole media was, Neil Armstrong's wife had a huge amount of media, and it's sort of been because Buzz was second, and then Mike Collins third, but they were just as important in many ways from the human element. And she certainly held her own, and she was tough.
She was tough, and she was clever. I mean, a dynamic I love to encounter in my own reading of fiction, Henry James, Dickens, all of those authors, is the collision, or George Eliot most of all, the collision between bright women and the forces that enclose them. And that's a dynamic that's happened throughout history. It still happens today. And in Joan's case, she was a very bright young woman with a very conventional father. She was a New Jersey girl. She studied at Rutgers University. Then she got a master's degree in theatrical studies from Columbia University. She had the beginnings of a very promising career on the stage, and then on television in New York. She appeared in these live television programs they had back then, Playhouse 90 and Climax, and she was going places. But then what I call the twin forces of patriarchy came to grab her. It's like
she got grabbed by.
She got grabbed.
She got grabbed by her mother, really, who wanted her to marry well.
Well, her mother did want her to marry well, but then her mother, poor mother, she was an accountant, and she was going with her brothers to an accounting festival, if there is such a.
Oh, the irony.
I'm sorry to have set you all off laughing, because what happened was the plane crashed into a mountain and they all died. So I'm sorry, it's my fault. But a lot of time has passed, but it was very funny for us, but tragic for Joan. Not only because she lost her mother, but because her father insisted that she abandon her career and come home to the family home and look after him, which is apparently what women did then, and she did that. So and it was when she was doing that so that's the first force, at patriarchy, literally the father force that has trapped her. And then the next thing is was a bit of an arranged meeting. She met Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, and then ended up marrying him, and was taken by him from New York, New Jersey, which she loved, New York basically, to Houston, which is a very different city, and not
Absolutely.
even Houston, a sort of a flat suburb of Houston, Spaceville, I call it. And she there was offered a radio program of her own using her maiden name, Archer. And she wanted to do it, so it wasn't even going to be about space.
No.
She would have just been a radio personality in Houston. And the NASA people, the men, got together, and Life magazine, who had special contracts with these astronauts, said no. And she was not allowed to do it. She was really annoyed. She said to Buzz, "I want to get out of town."
And town was a really restrictive place. You know, they were controlled by NASA, a lot of what they did. And surprisingly, they didn't get paid, the husbands didn't get paid that well. They weren't living the life of luxury. They were living pretty ordinary suburban lives. So while Buzz and Neil were off doing their thing and flying jets and being male, macho, smart, really smart, the wife still had to live a fairly ordinary lives, but quite restricted. And she did marry Buzz. Tell us, I think Buzz was a very complicated man, brilliantly intelligent. He was a fighter pilot, he was an engineer, a mathematician, and the list goes on really. He was really smart. He had sort of all sorts of patents on things later on in life. And he was also very religious, a very devout Christian. So he had a lot of stuff happening in his life. So can you tell us why you chose Buzz to be one of your characters?
I chose Buzz rather than Neil, for instance, because there's something godlike and unapproachable about Neil. So he stays at a bit of a distance in the narrative, which is where I think Neil belongs, because he is sort of a Superman. But Buzz is flawed and so much more approachable, and still alive, by the way, still with us. But he was an extraordinarily clever man. He got a doctorate from MIT, a doctorate in orbital dynamics from MIT University. So he was Dr. Aldrin. They called him Dr. Rendezvous, all his astronaut friends. He was, I think Neil or somebody said he was the smartest man ever to be flown into space. But sometimes with these smart people, he didn't have much emotional wisdom. So he was smart with his numbers, but not, I mean, he would piss people off all around the place.
Yes, and apparently he would get, quite intense. And
intense.
so Joan found that really difficult because she was a chatterbox and lively and happy, but he would just go into his world.
Exactly. He loved his numbers more than her sometimes. But it came out quite clearly when it became apparent that Neil Armstrong was going to be the first astronaut to walk out of the lunar module onto the surface of the moon. So it's Neil that said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz thought it was going to be him, and in the way they'd done the earlier programs, the Gemini program, it had been the commander staying inside while the other person did the EVA, the extravehicular activity, first. So they had been trained that way all the way up to February or March. The ship took off in July, but then they switched it, and I did a lot of work to find out why they switched from Buzz to Neil. But Buzz was devastated. He was devastated, and he embarked upon a program of lobbying, of ringing people, of getting his dad, who was very well known, to rig everybody in the Pentagon, and it just annoyed everybody. But in the end, the head of the Deke Slayton had to sit him down and say, "It's going to be Neil." So, Neil, and he sort of eventually got the message. But that stayed with him all his life, I think. And Mike Collins, the third of the astronauts, said Buzz Aldrin was a man who resented being second more than he appreciated going to the moon.
Yeah.
So
and that comes out really well in your book, that relationship between the two men, which I thought you handled incredibly well.
Thank you.
But his religion also, which I think is, this mathematician, this guy that goes into space, that sees all this stuff, still believes in a God, whereas Neil didn't. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so in this book I do pit mathematics and science and atheism against the humanities, religion, arts. That battle happens in this book. And Buzz is an interesting person because he was a deeply religious person, and as soon as the spacecraft landed on the moon, he carried out a ceremony of Holy Communion. He'd been banned from doing so by NASA because NASA had been sued by America's most famous atheist, Madeleine Murray O'Hair, for a previous mission where the astronauts on circling the moon had quoted from the Bible, from Genesis, the Apollo 8 mission. They'd done that, and so Madeleine promptly sued NASA, and NASA just didn't want to have anything to do with her. So they just said, Buzz, no, none of that stuff. But he did it privately. But Neil was watching him like a hawk. And what is Neil an atheist? Well, that's a question with a bottom that's difficult to find. I mean, my secret suspicion was that he was, but he knew he couldn't really say that.
Because Americans wanted him to be religious.
And his own mother was extremely religious, and he had to he was an everyman. He had to represent America, but even America was much more generous of spirit then. They realised what they were doing was for the whole world. It wasn't just America first; it was America as a representative of the whole world. And so Neil, in my view, the perfect representator of us all, mild, humble. And look, frankly, it was science that got him to the moon. And so if he's a believer in science more than religion, well, that's what science delivers. Yeah. Science delivers the moon. So I think it's almost appropriate if he was an atheist. But that dynamic, of course, especially as they find that in my version of events that their spaceship is stuck on the moon, that dynamic between the religious and the non-religious becomes quite important as their life reaches its certain, or is it?
And we can't really talk too much about that because we don't want to give away the ending.
Whatever happens in the end, as that approaches, religion matters.
And it matters a lot, but it mattered to Buzz. So that whole bit about the communion, NASA forbade him from doing that, but he was going to do it anyway. And it's wonderfully done in the book. And then our third character is none other than Norman Mailer, who at this stage, I think had won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Yeah. He was like a god in the US. He was quite an extraordinary man. He was prolific in his writing, and he was contracted by Life magazine to go and write about the moon landing. He was given the job of writing about the more kind of technical stuff, really. But that wasn't enough for Norman Mailer, was it? He wanted more. Tell us about Norman.
Norman always wanted more. I don't know how much is known of Norman these days. I mean, a controversial character. Back then, even more so now, perhaps a little bit cancelled because he was a male chauvinist pig.
Well, he stabbed his wife.
He stabbed his wife and so on. And I would never like to, minimise those crimes. But that's not why I'm about to say what I'm about to say. He had an enormous intellect. His writing is electric, with insights, with metaphors, with symbols, with wonder. And he loved women. He loved women.
He loved 6 of them, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. And
as did Buzz Aldrin. Buzz is on his 6th wife as well. I mean,
at every level he loved them. So he saw them, this is both good and bad, and it's not really up to me to comment on the politics of this, but he saw them as an equal entity, and if they're an equal entity, then they can be fought with. You know, he didn't hold his metaphorical punches, and on one famous occasion he did, they'd been on booze all weekend, and he did stab his wife, and he never forgave himself for that. Who cares about what he forgave? But nor did his wife.
Nor did she. That's right.
Although she did.
She didn't remarry him, didn't she?
She did stand up for him in court,
that's
and
it
was
court,
her evidence that kept him out of jail. So look, these all add an interesting layer. I mean, the gender dynamics of the 1960s are just extraordinary. And he started out at Harvard being an engineer. So he was a bright man doing engineering things. He decided he hated machines and he wanted to write about people instead. But Life magazine said, look, we've got Dodie Hamlin writing about the people. We want you to write about the machines.
Can you just tell everyone who Dodie is? Because that's a lovely relationship within the book too.
Yeah, I love Dodie.
I love Dodie too.
Dodie Hamlin was a journalist for Life magazine. and she always smoked a cigarette through one of those cigarette holders. She didn't have any kids, and she wandered around the world doing whatever she wanted to do, and they were always interesting things. She went hiking through the Yukon looking for some missing plane person. She did everything, and she had real oomph and character. And
to me, she was like a real broad.
Yeah, real broad.
A real broad.
She's sort of from John Wayne territory. Yeah. She's sort of a John Wayne type, and she really did do this when she was researching the space astronauts, the wives mainly. They all lived around the circumference of this lake called Lake Clear, and their houses were around it, like out here. And so she would row her own red canoe from house to house. So she'd turn up just out there. Who's that in the... Oh, it's Dodie come. And she'd put a cigarette out and her martini away and then come up and sit and chat. And she used to go into... You know those hairdressers where you have that thing on your head, drying your hair? She'd sit next to the wives and get all the gossip. And you can imagine the husbands are away, and you know, because this is in Houston, the husbands had to go to Florida for their training, and they would meet. These girls would love these astronauts because they'd fly there in their T-38 jets, land, drive their Corvettes around the place. The girls in Florida fell in love with them. They were called Cape Cookies. Cape Cookies. So the men would go and have some Cape Cookies, and this formed the basis of gossip in the hairdressing salons of Clear Lake, and Dodie was part of all that, and of course she was writing it all down, and.
But then there also came this kind of conflict between her and Norman Mailer when they're both there, writing about the mission.
Yeah, there's a sort of fight over territory, and when Dodie is in Joan's house, and the lunar programs, the lunar mission is happening, and their buzz is on the moon. Dodie doesn't really want Norman there, or Aquarius. He called himself that, Aquarius.
Why did he call himself Aquarius?
Because he's born in January, and Aquarius, and it was the age of Aquarius. It all just fits together nicely. Yes. So I call him Aquarius as well, and you get used to it after a while. And and I like it because it gives him one little level away from the real man. It sort of is an invention. It's him inventing a version of himself. And in my book, it's me inventing a version of himself. But he, interacts with these women in I find very, very, very interesting ways.
Oh yeah, and it's a wonderful relationship between him and Joan. So there are our three main characters, and so we're talking a lot about, and we're going to run out of time, so we want to move along a little bit. In the book too, there's also a lot of talk about politics. There's the politics of NASA. There's the politics of the Kennedys, who really, John Kennedy really wanted the space mission they really wanted to beat the Russians. And there's also the politics of Martin Luther King and how the women also interacted in that world of all that politics. You've read all these transcripts. You've read a lot of stuff. So I just want to talk a little bit about your research, what you found out that really blew your mind, and the politics of the time, how it affected NASA. That's a lot of questions. But let's just take the first about your research, which is remarkable.
Well, it was 1968, 1969. I mean, 1969 is an extraordinary year, just technologically. It wasn't just the Saturn V taking men to the moon. It was the first flight of the 747. It was the first flight of the Concorde. It seemed like there was, and when they landed on the moon successfully and returned to Earth and fulfilled John Fitzgerald Kennedy's promise, everybody then just thought, well, in 10 years we will be on Mars. By the turn of the century, we will be at the nearest star. By 1990, there will be hospitals on the moon for the elderly because it's good for your arthritis, sixth gravity. And so they really, the plans were all there. And when I look back on the 50 or so years since then, none of that has happened. None of that has happened.
Quite
not only
contrary.
have we've not been back. Yeah. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, there's been some probes landed on the moon, but forgive me for not getting that thrilled about that when I've studied the human beings. walking on the moon. Six times they did that. So it was an extraordinary period. But the year before, 1968, was high 60s. I mean, that's when Martin Luther King was assassinated. That's when the Vietnam War was at its peak. That's when Nixon was on the scene and becoming president. It's when Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated during the primary.
And there was also Ted Kennedy during the mission.
And exactly to the day that when Neil and Buzz were walking on the moon, or at least preparing to, Edward Kennedy, the youngest of the brothers, had been involved in an accident where at Chappaquiddick in Martha's Vineyard, where he had really left a girl, Mary Jo Kopechne, to die in an upturned car. And that he must have known that on that day, that would be the end of his attempts to be the President of the United States. And I think the world, America, would have known that. So given that it was 1969, there was a lot of sympathy for Ted Kennedy. Oh no, his career. Oh no. What about the young girl? And there is one of my lines, there's in an early chapter, Joan pulls up Aquarius because he's worrying excessively about the damage to the reputation of Ted Kennedy, rather than worrying about the girl who's dead and her family.
And Joan says that beautifully.
She says, they have a misunderstanding. I forget exactly how it works, but
But Joan was also, you would think that a lot of these people were conservative, but she was very pro Martin Luther King. She had a few things to say, and you bring those out rather beautifully in the book.
Yes, she did. And I mean, a lot of the Astro wives were quite socially progressive, but they were forced by NASA to perform the role of the dutiful wife. And Betty Friedan's book had just come out, which every woman had on her bedside table, called The Feminine Mystique. And that book highlighted the plight of women, especially educated women, or who were married to husbands and had no role other than the servicing of his every needs. And she describes women all across America looking around at their beautiful houses, saying, "Is this all? Is this it?" And so that dynamic, "is this all?" really plays an important part in this book, because Joan, under pressure when things go wrong on the moon, is compelled to ask that question later on.
And she also breaks quite a few of the rules.
And she breaks quite a few of the rules. And because the one rule was that the astronauts' wives had to be thrilled, proud and happy.
All the time.
No matter what.
They all had to, and that was their motto, thrilled, proud and happy.
So if you had a microphone shoved in front of your face, which often happened, tell us about your husband. Well, I'm thrilled, proud and happy.
And they did. But going back to that kind of, that time, so a lot was happening. When you were doing your research, and especially NASA, because NASA was very male, and the women were not allowed to go anywhere near NASA. They had their minders, they had people looking after them. But there was the politics of NASA. There was the politics of the hierarchy within NASA of who could talk to who. But there's also the engineering. There's this engineering firm that made these extraordinary rockets, and that company had a part to play. Then there is the German who designed the rocket.
Yes.
So all this research you did, how did you do it? Where did it all come? Because there's a lot. You know all about buttons and jets and friction and all sorts of stuff. And I said earlier that we're talking about three of the characters. Well, to me, they were the human characters. But within the book, there's also these non-human characters. The ship is, do we call it a ship? The ship is a character. The moon, the beautiful moon, and how you describe that is a character. So I'd like to, just tell us about your research, because it's extraordinary what you've done in this book.
Well, I've got two words to say. COVID. Make it three. COVID lockdown. So COVID was a horrible time, but it did trap me in my flat in Sydney for quite a while, and there I had access to, because they're all publicly available, all of the schematics, all the diagrams you could ever want to have access to for these spacecraft. And I always knew that there was a limit to how much of this technical matter could make its way to the surface of a novel, because how many people want to read more than maybe 3 sentences about a gadget or a titanium double interlock valve or whatever. But I, for my own benefit, had to come up with what I thought could be a plausible failure for the lunar module. The lunar module was the spacecraft that landed on the moon, and it was the most beautifully designed spacecraft ever, and it never did fail. It landed 6 times without a hitch. It was, and that is a triumph of human design, because the only times they were designed on Earth, tested on Earth, and then used on the moon. And the moon's very different to the Earth. There's no atmosphere and so on. So gravity's less. So they were a triumph. But how could it fail? Well, I figured out a way that it could fail by reading the book written by the man who designed the spacecraft. And there's a chapter there he says, this is the way that it could fail, and this is the thing I was really worried about. And I thought, okay, well, I'll use that way.
And you did it beautifully, because, for me who can barely add 2 and 2, I got it. And that was a real skill of understanding. And it actually added to all the tension that was going on in the book. So
well, when you're a writer, you're always, and I don't think I'm giving too much away when I say this about the book, but you're always alive to the possibilities of metaphor. I mean, everything you write sort of is a metaphor. And when I discovered this way of failure, it is that the oxidizer, stay with me, oxidizer might secretly leak away from the titanium tank that held the oxidizer. And then there was another tank with fuel in it. So, but there's no air on the moon, so the fuel needs the oxidizer in that tank. And fuel and oxidizer react hypergolically, and flames erupt. It's almost like a love story. And I thought, oh, hang on, here we have, they're under enormous pressure. The oxidizer wants to escape, but the male titanium holds it in. I sort of start to see,
and it's really like that in the book.
And then suddenly the fuel is still there, but where's the oxidizer? It's like a husband without.
You need to stop telling too much.
Where's so I see the fuel and oxidizer almost as a metaphor for Buzz and Buzz and Joan's marriage, which is the love has slowly leaked away, and they press all the buttons you like. It's not going to take off again.
You did it beautifully.
The working title of this book was The Button.
The button. Look, the button is also a main character in this, because we fix the button, but it is done incredibly well. But you did tell me that you can actually read all the NASA transcripts. You can actually read every single communication between the astronaut and NASA on the ground. That must have been a task, because there would have been some pretty boring things in there. But then there would have been the human element, because there was a relationship. There was only one person that would speak to the astronauts. Is that correct?
That's right. Capcom,
that's it.
It was a sort of, so on the ground in Houston, there was only one per every, because otherwise you'd have 1,000 voices amongst all the controllers and so on down in Houston talking to the guys in the spaceship, so they had to direct all of their questions through this one guy called Capcom. And I met the guy, actually.
Oh, did you?
Charlie Duke. He became an astronaut in a subsequent mission.
Because you also met the astronauts, didn't you?
I met Buzz.
You met Buzz,
I met Buzz. That was interesting. But he I forgot what I was saying. Oh, yeah, so it all goes through this Capcom. And that's an interesting relationship as well, the relationship between the men in the spacecraft and NASA on the ground, or mission control on the ground, who also control the astronauts' access to their wives.
On the squawk
and
box.
the wives' access to the astronauts. So when things go wrong, and this actually happened, for instance, in one of Neil's earlier flights, NASA immediately turned the squawk box off. So suddenly Janet wife
Knew
Neil,
something was wrong.
but didn't know what it was. She instantly rang the mission control people and said, "This is Janet Armstrong. Reconnect the squawk box," and they didn't. She got into her car and drove the short distance to the mission control and went to the doors, and they wouldn't let her in. And
there were guards that wouldn't let her in.
Is in my book is that when the men are dying, the wives must stay away. The wives must stay away. And so in my book, when the button doesn't work and they've got a long time ahead of them, Joan isn't happy with that. She wants to be a part of the solution.
And she knows something's going horribly wrong.
She knows something's going horribly wrong. And she also knows, I mean, I don't know if I'm saying too much here, but there are elements of the real Buzz Aldrin's life which Joan knew, which she wasn't sure Mission Control would factor in properly. And what I'm talking about is just before Buzz went to the moon, his own mother committed suicide. And not only that, but her father committed suicide as well. Not at the same time, years earlier. So there's this history of suicide in Buzz's family, which means if the option is left to Neil and Buzz, the only thing left to them is suicide, well, Buzz might not want to do that. So Joan is worried that, look, if you've left them suicide pills or whatever, Buzz has always said he would never do that, which means he might just be left in this spacecraft, which is slowly heating up. The moon's a hot place, 100 degrees Celsius. And if it's without power, it starts to heat up. And it's they're running out of oxygen too. But worse than running out of oxygen, the CO2 is increasing, the carbon dioxide, and that causes panic. So there's a lot of suffering before the end. And that's what she's not happy with.
Yeah. So but in that too, there's also Neil being an atheist, Buzz being a devout Christian. Do they go that next step? But we won't talk about that now because you have to read the book because it's really fascinating. What I didn't know, which I thought was really stupid, really, I don't know why. So Mike Collins is orbiting the moon in
the command module.
The command module, and that's called
Columbia.
Columbia.
Yep.
On the ground, that's called the Eagle.
The Eagle.
The Eagle. So when we hear the Eagle has landed, so now they're communicating to Mike, going round and round and round. He's only got so much fuel to go round and round and round. Tell us a bit about Mike Collins, the third person in this.
Well, Mike Collins, he was known to be the nicest of all the astronauts, and he was a lovely fellow, and I used to watch him a lot on, he's recently died, but I used to follow him a lot on YouTube. But he was sort of the glue that kept this group together, because there was odd Buzz, reserved Neil, and then there was happy Mike. And when I said earlier that Mike said of Buzz that he was the man who was more unhappy about being second than he was happy about going to the moon, you've got to remember that Mike didn't go to the moon at all. So he was the third member. He went 99% of the way, but then never stepped foot on the moon. So he had to be happy with that. So you can imagine him being a bit annoyed at Buzz and saying, Buzz, you're getting on to go on the moon, just be happy. But Mike was happy. He kept saying over and over again, I'm not sure people ever believed him, that he was perfectly happy only to go 99% of the way. But his main worry is he's just orbiting, waiting for them to finish, then their ship comes up and redocks with his ship, and then they go back to Earth. There's no other way to get back to Earth other than via returning to Mike. So if they can't get up off the moon's surface, Mike cannot go down and get them. He has to leave. So that would be one step of this protocol that NASA had ready to go. They had things ready to go. One would be a speech from the United States president, which was actually written out for Nixon. Then the astronauts would say goodbye to their wives and children. Then Mike would be given the order to fire his engine and leave them, even though at that time the Vietnam War was at its height, and it was the very worst thing. These are all military men. The very worst thing you could do is leave fallen soldiers on the field. But Mike had his orders. You must come back and leave them. So they have a little farewell scene there as well, and so those were his duties, and he I think he does some pretty. He drinks. He's got a. He loves French wine, and that's true. He and his wife got married in France, and he ended up becoming the taster of all of NASA's food, and he became member of a particular French wine society. So he's a very fine wine drinker, and that plays an important part as well. I mean,
we could talk about this book.
There's a bottle of red wine that I ended up having to for the book launch I bought the bottle of red wine. It was very expensive. I thought it was $800, but then I eventually found one for $160, which was the lucky door prize.
Now, I'm looking at our clock, and I knew this had happened.
I'll stop.
We are talking, and we could talk for another hour because it's such a fascinating book and so many wonderful things. But I'm sure some of you have questions. So is there any... Oh, we have a lady over there in the corner, please. Just a microphone will come round.
David, I find your whole perspective absolutely amazing. I lived through that in Washington, D.C. From the time that Nixon was there. We were involved in the politics, the diplomacy, and I went to the launch of Apollo 2 when it met with this Russian spaceship in...
after the moon program? The Soyuz
program? No, this was
program?
before. This was 71, 72, 73.
After.
So the Apollo program finished in 72,
yes,
so it must have been after that.
It was the meeting of the American ship with the Russian ship.
The Soyuz.
Which was a bit like going to the Easter show. We were all in seats all the way around. I don't know what distance we were away from the launch, but we walked in the hangar and we saw the site and everything. But your perspective on it, I can understand all the diplomacy. You talk about the wives. I understand that too, all too well, because if you've been close to training of American Marines and what happens to their wives, and the Vietnam War was on as well, so we were meeting all of them. So I find your fascination and perspective with it just extraordinary. I've sort of put it in a box and shut it all away.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Lots of questions.
Yes.
Hi, David. You've been to inner space at the bottom of the North Atlantic, been to outer space on the moon. Where are you heading next?
Thank you.
I think you're speaking metaphorically, because the Atlantic, I stayed on the surface. I don't have the courage to dive down to the wreck, especially given the Titan, and I've certainly not been much. Not beyond 30. Yeah, what's next? Well, down, up. I might stay on the Earth for my next one. I've got an idea. We'll see what happens.
But we will certainly invite him back, because I think when he does write this book, we'll have a lot more fun.
Yeah, a lot more fun. Yeah, I'm hoping the next one, fun things happen. Not that fun things don't happen in this book.
Yes, I remember the landing very well, and it's the first time my mother has ever watched a program like that, in 1969 this is. But just to go back, has NASA ever made any comment on your book?
Not yet. Strangely, that was something that I was worried about. But I've not heard anything from them or from Buzz, because when I was writing it, Buzz was still alive, so I had to be very careful. I don't think he would worry, but I had to make sure that I wasn't saying things which were cruel or defamatory in any way of NASA or of any of the real people. And in fact, my guiding principle for the whole book was one of respect, because they're heroes of mine. And so it's a bit tricky, in the made-up, the counter-history parts, where what would they have done in this extreme situation? I didn't want to make one a coward and one a hero or whatever. I wanted they would have kept the essence of their personality, and I hope that I've done that.
You have, actually. I'm going to jump in here. I thought one of the great things about the book was that I really felt I got to know your characters, but I also felt that there was a deep respect from you, the way you'd written this. There's nothing other than Norman Mailer, but he deserved what he got. But I think you handled it incredibly respectfully. And to NASA as well, which I don't think they deserved a huge amount of respect in some instances, but that's another thing. I think we have another question over here.
I'm just wondering, I guess until you get to the moon, you're kind of pegging the story off history, reality.
Yes.
Yes. And the same sort of thing in the Midnight Watch, that there's a lot of real life people, events, etc. that you're hanging on. Do you find that, how do you sort of graft the shape of a novel over that? Did it just kind of happen naturally because the events themselves were so compelling, or did you feel like you had to massage things to give it the right structure that you wanted?
Well, the answer to that is that the demands of fiction, the demands of storytelling, always have to come first. And I particularly noticed that in the Titanic book, because there's so much of interest in that story that I would love every reader to read about. But it didn't always fit the knitting needle vector that I had to tell. But the great thing about history is it gives great plot. Not just the large structured events like the sinking of the Titanic or the landing of the moon, but little things which your imagination might struggle to make up. For instance, in the Moon book, Buzz's eldest son was obsessed with getting a boa constrictor from the store next down the road, and he was more interested in that because he loved animals than he was that his father's on the moon, and that creates an interesting dynamic. And and of course, again, always alive to metaphor. Where as I'm reading the historical thing, I see serpent. Aha! Serpent in a cage. Temptation. Lots of resonances. So the serpent and then other animals end up playing an important part in the story. Buzz Aldrin had a monkey, and Buzz loved that monkey. Many people said he loved it more than Joan, and it would tease Joan. It would. When Buzz was away down in Florida, the monkey would throw feces at Joan, and it would hang from the chandelier when she had people over and laugh at her. But then if she locked it up in the cage, it would refuse its food and start to die. So she had to let it run free. So when it was when it was free, Joan suffered. When it wasn't free, it suffered. But in the end, it drowned in their pool. And Joan was seen in the vicinity.
Well, we were going to do a Q&A actually, but we've run out of time. We have run out of time, but there's this monkey features, and again, another metaphor.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, because did he love that monkey more than he loved his wife?
Yeah.
And even his relationship with his children is so fascinating.
Yeah, interesting.
It's interesting.
Yes,
Look,
yes.
we could, as I said, you are amazing, David. We have, I think, all enjoyed this immensely. Please thank David.
Thank you for your question. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.